There we go. And then it will be available on MENAS YouTube channel. And then finally, feel free to open your cameras with us so that we can all interact with each other if you would like. So today we are pleased to have with us Professor Richard Nielsen, who is an associate professor at MIT. He holds a PhD in government and an AM in statistics from Harvard University and a BA from Brigham Young University. At MIT, Richard is also associated with the Center for International Studies, Security Studies Program, the Institute for Data Systems and Society, and the Political Methodology Lab. His research look at the study of Islam, terrorism and political violence, human rights, economic development and foreign aid, and research methods. He's also the author of the book Deadly Clerics, published in 2017, which explores the radicalization processes of jihadi clerics in the Arab world. He's the author of several papers published in the AGPS, International Studies Quarterly, Political Analysis, and so on and so forth. If you didn't know yet, but Richard is also the developer of two cool R packages, which are Arabic Stemmer R and Persian Stemmer. And today he will be presenting to us a paper he published at the AGPS and a follow-up research on the same topic. The paper explores an exciting but also puzzling research question on how and why conservative women are gaining authority in movements that supposedly endorse patriarchal ideologies. And I'll stop here and I'll give the floor to Richard.
Great, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen if I can
yes,
get that to work. We should have tested this beforehand, but now we will. All right. I seem to be seeing my slides, and the question is whether you are seeing my slides. It looks like you may be seeing them, but not in the full window view.
Yes.
So let's try that. How about now?
Nice.
Okay. Great. So thanks so much for having me. I've given the talk a little different title, how the internet helps women gain authority in Islam, because I'm going to talk about the paper that was published recently, but also this is very much live research. I'll explain, you know, I have plans for this, but I very much welcome your input, your suggestions, your corrections, and your participation through this. I realize Zoom seminars can get tedious, honestly. And so if you want to interrupt in the middle, you can try to put up your blue hand, or if that's not working, because it's sometimes hard for me to see even in a format like this who's raising their hand, go ahead and unmute your mic when I pause sometime and interrupt if you're lost, because there's no point in being, you know, lost all the way to the end of the talk. I'm going to try to talk for 30 minutes, but I have a tendency to go long. So I'll really try to, I may even skip some slides to try to limit myself so that we can get to questions and the interactive portion. Does that sound right, Ameni? Great. Okay. Oh, now that I've gone to full screen mode, somehow I'm not able to click through. All right, here we are. So the impetus for this is thinking about broadly how the internet is changing Islam, which has been something I've seen since I was doing field work for my first book. So this is a fieldwork photo of a printing press in Egypt. It's in the old Islamic district, kind of tucked away in a street corner that someone took me to see. And it used to be if you wanted to read the Quran, you had to go get a print copy, which really was an innovation in and of itself, right? If we think about the long historical sweep. But now if you want to read the Quran, you just download Al-Quran for iPhone, right? It used to be if you wanted Islamic teaching, you had to go to a study circle. This is a halaqah that I sat in and took a picture of at Al-Azhar University. It's one of the prominent teaching mosques in all of Sunni Islam. But actually, they were videotaping the same thing, and you can get it on YouTube now. This is actually, these are both lectures that I was sitting in from 2011, so a while ago, right? Especially in internet years, that's really a long time ago. It used to be if you wanted Islamic guidance, you had to go to find a cleric to give you a fatwa. This is a picture of the fatwa office. Actually, it's not a picture of the it's where you'd think the fatwa office is in Egypt, but actually the fatwa office is like below this picture. The kind of grungy building that you can see just the top of is really where you go to get a fatwa from Al-Azhar. But now you can just go online and get a fatwa, and you can ask. So if you can read Arabic, you can see that this fatwa is one that would make you blush if you were to ever ask it in person to a cleric. Like most of the internet, it is about sex. This was, as of the time, the most viewed fatwa on islamweb.net, I believe is where I got this from, 1.5 million views. It used to be that if you were looking for extreme teachings, perhaps, you might have to go find a print copy of Sayyid Qutb's Fi Dhilal al-Quran. This is a tafsir, a religious commentary. His book of jihad is kind of seen as one of the source materials for a number of Islamist militant groups. But now, thanks to the internet, you can actually just go find it online. And it used to be that you thought that this person, who is the chief mufti of Saudi Arabia, was basically unassailable, could not even be criticized. But again, thanks to the internet, we have internet cartoons circulating that make fun of him as a battery-operated tool of the state. And this is, in fact, a screenshot of his website having been hacked by the, what does it say, electronic Houthi forces a few years ago. I even found this by accident. I was checking his website, and this was what was there instead. So I'm really interested in Islam, politics, and the internet. This comes out of my work on deadly clerics, and I'm now trying to turn this into a book on Islamic authority in the internet age. So where this talk really fits in is I'm hoping to have a chapter or several chapters about how the internet is changing the authority of women. But I've been honestly very slow working on the book. COVID has not helped. I was supposed to be on leave this year, finishing the book, and goodness knows that hasn't happened because I can't think straight with a pandemic going on. So it's hard to get deep work done. If you're struggling, I'm very sympathetic. But I did manage to publish a piece related to just this thing on women, which is the paper that you may have seen in the American Journal of Political Science. And then I have another forthcoming chapter that I'm going to present also some findings from, and the hope is to build on this. And so, like I said, I really would, even though pieces of it are published, your feedback is not in vain. Like, you can help make this better. If you see real problems with what I've done, please do let me know and offer suggestions for what I should do next. All right, so the puzzle of this paper in particular is, it really starts with kind of an exploration of this major Salafi website that I was spending a fair amount of time on for my first project because I was trying to gather data. And the puzzle here is that Salafism is a patriarchal religious movement. If you go look at the kind of norms around Salafism, okay, sorry, back up. Just in case anyone isn't aware, Salafism is a social movement within Islam that's trying to seek a return to what they see as the true doctrines of Islam as understood by the Salaf, who are the pious companions of the Prophet Muhammad. So kind of an originalist movement seeking to go back to kind of a perception that there were practices of Islam at the beginning that were pure and now may have become impure or muddled through human interpretation by clerics over many years, right? This ideology believes that authority rests with men, by and large, although we'll complicate that today. There isn't a lot of space for women's authority, and certainly Salafis are known, I think, for trying to avoid the sin, as they perceive it, of gender mixing, so having mixed gender audiences, certainly in person, and there's debate about whether this is true in online fora as well. So my puzzle is going to be, why are there 43 female preachers on a major Salafi website? And I want to show you that website such as it was when I did the paper. It's actually, the visual aesthetic has changed a little bit now. They like updated in the last year. Kind of interesting, just the internet, changes, right, as we're trying to study it. But this is what it looked like at the time. This is the home page. And you can see there's a sidebar here. And if you click on this highlighted piece of the sidebar, which says Ulamat wa Talbat al-Ilm, you get to, that means scholars and seekers of knowledge. You get to this list of about 170 male preachers. And these are very prominent people listed at the top, like extremely famous sheikhs. And then as you go down, there's, a very long list of less famous sheikhs who are on this website. But then here's the puzzle. If you look down on the sidebar where I've highlighted, there's another entry, it's Multaq Idayat, and that is a list of female preachers, which is right here, and there's 43 of them, or there was at the time that I was doing the study. And you can see the visual aspect here is very different, which there's kind of a cool thing to do here about visual culture in internet Islam, which I'm trying to do, but I'm not really there yet. That's a piece of the book that has not come together. But let's click on, well, we're imagining we're clicking on, these are all prepared slides, obviously, but if we click on the first one, this is the page of, and it notes that she has a doctorate, Umayma bint Ahmed al-Jalahma. And if you click through, you get a list of documents. There's also a link to her Twitter. If you go click on the Twitter, you can see, again, there's a screenshot from a while ago now. But if we zoom in, it actually says she's a writer and an associate professor at the University of Dammam, specializing in Aqidah, so creed, and comparative religion. And I really identify with this because I'm also an associate professor. And this actually harkens back to a point I was trying to make in Deadly Clerics, which is that Muslim clerics, by and large, understand themselves as academics and actually often hold academic positions, even though, Western scholarship, and especially scholarship on jihadi terrorism, views them as, something else, right? Doesn't see them as academics. Okay, so we're going to click through on one more. Again, a list of documents. And the reason I click on this one is that for the English speakers here, everyone zooms in on the Power Rangers, what's going on with the Power Rangers. This has a special resonance with my generation, although maybe not with everyone here. If you click through, this really is just a screed against the evils of the film The Power Rangers, because it indoctrinates the youth to believe that witchcraft and magic is okay. It's very similar to the work that conservative Christian women were doing in the US and the UK, opposing the Harry Potter novels. Actually, I think this work happened in Arabic by Muslims as well. But this one's about Power Rangers. Okay, so again, the puzzle, why are there 43 female preachers on a major Salafi website? And this really is a major Salafi website. I now realize I probably should have put in a slide with like web traffic to convince you of that, but just bear with me that, trust me that it is a quite prominent one. So I'm going to give you, for the rest of the talk, some theory about why I think this is going on, some evidence, and we'll probably spend most of the time on the evidence. I'm an empiricist at the end of the day. I like trolling through evidence on the internet, especially, is how we're going to do it here. But I'm going to try to let the data speak to you, and you can see whether it matches up with my theory or not. And then I'll conclude with some implications. If there's any questions about the website in particular, or the things you just saw, I'm happy to pause for a second and answer those. Okay, hearing none, I'll keep proceeding. But again, don't hesitate to unmute and interrupt. All right, so I'm going to frame this as there being two competing arguments. It's a little more complicated than that. And in the paper, I try to, be more nuanced about, some of the previous scholarship, because those folks were reviewers on the paper, not least, right? And so they deserve for me to be, to represent them fairly. I'm going to try to represent them fairly here too, but at the risk of a little violence to the arguments that have been there, I'm going to frame most of the existing arguments as being about gender appropriateness, and then mine as being about a social movement logic that's distinct, right? And elements of the social movement logic do appear in some of the others. That's where I'm maybe drawing a little too hard of a distinction, but I'm very hard on the social movement logic side. And I think that's what explains the discrepancies we're going to see between what other scholars expected and what I'm finding in the online data. So the gender appropriateness logic, I think, is well represented, although this isn't the only piece, by Medawi Rashid's book, A Most Masculine State. Al-Rashid is not a political scientist, and so she's not as interested as I am in testing causal arguments, right? She's an anthropologist. She's making, and a bit of a historian too, she's making claims about what has happened and describing things. She spent a lot of time on description, but her claim really is that, and she covers some of the same women, in fact, citing some of the same documents from the same website, right? Her interpretation of them is that these are women preaching for women because it is inappropriate for women to preach to men, and it's also inappropriate for men to preach on certain subjects to women, perhaps, right? So it might be inappropriate for, or a man might feel uncomfortable preaching to women about menstruation, for example, and so we'll have, women speak on women's issues. A related argument, although one that's closer to the social movement logic, is that, yes, these norms that Al-Rashid is pointing out exist, but also there are women who are themselves wanting to be activists, right? And so they have to come up with rhetorical tools to fight against this gender appropriateness logic. And so they do that personally and individually. This is Leahy Ben Shitrit's book, which I really admire. Honestly, the paper I wrote in the AJPS is kind of a love note to this book because I admire it so much. I still think she's wrong about some things, or at least her theory doesn't apply to the Salafi women I'm studying in the way that she might have thought it would. But I think the argument's really, really interesting and has a lot of power, which is that women carve out spaces for their activism by claiming that there are exceptional times that demand exceptional efforts by women. And so, yes, of course, we know that women aren't supposed to, be involved in activism, aren't supposed to preach, aren't supposed to get in fist fights. One of the things that Leahy documents, among her female activists. But these are exceptional times, and so we can do these things, and then we'll go back to being housewives and mothers in a domestic sphere without any outside authority once the temporary cause has been achieved, right? I think that she has a lot of evidence for this in the cases she's studying. I just don't think it works so well. And then the social movement logic is what I do think works well for the women that I'm studying. And I'm going to describe it just a little more in the next slide. So the basic claim is that social movement outreach ends up trumping gender norms. And to start out with, I'll say that Salafis have been pragmatic for a long time. So they're very doctrinaire about certain things, including, the famous one is like the length of your beard must be at least a fist, and like all these, these kind of things around gender that are seem really like almost like a formula for it's like if there's a cookbook for religion, and if you just follow these 120,000 rules, like you too can be a good Salafi, right? And then the point of the internet is to debate the rules. But I'm arguing that instead they're actually quite practical about being flexible on certain issues if it helps expand the movement. And that this is one of those cases where the internet helps them expand the movement, and women preaching on the internet helps expand the movement much more than trying to just recruit more men to preach on the internet. And the reason is that, Salafism as a patriarchal movement started out with primarily male leaders, and still has primarily male leaders, but there's a limit, I theorize, to who those leaders can reach. Different sectors of society just respond to different calls, right? And so a different spokesperson is going to be able to reach different types of audiences. And Salafism on the internet has basically hit its limit of who it can reach with the existing spokespersons. And so what the leaders decided to do was to try to increase the breadth of spokespersons, and expanding into having female spokespersons was the kind of obvious way to do this. There was some precedent for having, actually, a fair amount of precedent, more than we think often, for having female preachers in a small enclosed setting. So, well, why not put them on the internet, and we'll put them in women's sections and pretend that, that will keep them segregated. And then actually we see that they reach out to these new audiences, and in fact, that will then make them quite prominent on the website. So they can reach new audiences online, and they can also help support Salafi patriarchy. So this is often puzzling to Western audiences who aren't really comfortable with the idea of women supporting patriarchy. I think there's evidence of it happening all over the world in all kinds of times and places, and so I don't think it's puzzling or confusing. I do think it's worth understanding. Women can make this argument for Salafism that the male preachers can't. So, for example, if they want to oppose the UN Convention on Rights for Women, which I'm messing up the name of all of a sudden, but bear with me. The women can say, as a woman, I don't want these so-called rights. And that's a very powerful argument to a segment of the Salafi audience that a man simply can't make. Okay, so now I've breezed through these a little too quickly, so feel free to circle back if you're confused or want clarification on parts of the theoretical argument. I think these have really contrasting, actually, implications for what we'd expect to see in the data that I'm about to show you from the website. And spoiler alert, I'm going to find that the social movement logic has a lot more support, otherwise it wouldn't have written a paper, right? But I do want to lay it out for you so you can see how I thought about it, right? So the gender appropriateness logic from Ben Sheetreat, we would see that these are, at most self-promoting teachers who are defying a gender norm to be there. In the social movement logic, we'd see that they're actually recruited, that the male leaders of Salafism went and found them and put them online, something like that. The gender appropriateness logic would say that they preach exclusively to women and that they preach exclusively on women's topics, right? They wouldn't preach on something that would be aimed at men. The social movement logic says they'll preach to men as well, because some men may respond to women's preaching better, or may be more inclined to join the movement as a result. The gender appropriateness logic suggests that male authority is the prototypical type of authority and that women will mimic it. The social movement logic suggests actually that women's ability to use different authority claims and different authority styles, like as a woman, I think, etc., that will be really important. And then the gender appropriateness logic would say that there will be no male interest in these preachers, or perhaps negative male interest. They'll get trolled on the internet, there will be a lot of sexism, etc. Whereas the social movement logic suggests that there will be positive male interest. So then our questions for the empirics are really going to be, how are female preachers recruited? Do they preach exclusively on women's topics? How do they establish authority in their writing? And is there a receptive male audience for them? Any questions before I get to the data? I'm already running slow too, so I'm really gonna work on speeding it up. Okay, so moving to the evidence. So this is a summary of the evidence from Said.net, which is the website that I showed you, which really created the puzzle for me. And then at the end, I'll move to a different source, Aluka.net, which is another prominent Islamic website. It's not quite so focused on Salafism per se, but I need it for as a data source. I'll explain why. So first, well, actually, this was the last piece temporally, but at the very end of my research, one of the reviewers on the paper said, you need to actually just ask these women how they were recruited. And so I emailed every man and every woman on that list. I did not get a ton of responses, I'll be honest. Response rate was really low, right? But the women who wrote back to me said that in some cases, they've been put on the website without their knowledge. In other cases, they've been elevated to the title of da'iya, so preacher, when they themselves did not consider themselves to be a preacher, right? So this suggests to me that the administrators are actually trying to promote women in authority. They're trying to find women who can help their movement and elevate them rather than these being, insurgents. I do think these women are, empowered women working on their own to produce Islamic material. I don't think they're like sock puppets for the men. And I actually checked on that. As far as I can tell, they are all actual women. It's not men writing, under pseudonyms or anything like that. But certainly the administrators of the website were very interested in promoting these women, is what that showed. I'm not going to talk more about that evidence. Then I'm going to look at how authority gets constructed. We'll talk about how men use the Salafi method, which is to use citations to the Hadith and Quran very heavily. Women are not going to use that nearly as much. Instead, women are going to use their identity a lot more than men. They'll still also use citations. I'm not saying that women don't use citations, but it's like at half the rates of men on every topic. Women are going to reach new audiences online. I'm going to show you that with some Twitter data. And then I'll show you with the Aluka data that these majority male audiences are in fact receptive in many cases to the teaching that they're seeing. Okay, so what do women write about? There was a lot of work to take the documents from this website and put them into a format where I could analyze them. And I'm going to buzz through this, but I'm very happy to talk about the details at extreme length. Basically, I take every document from the website, cull out a few that aren't in English, and do some pre-processing on them so I can do statistical text analysis, including the R package, which you so kindly mentioned. And I hope is useful, and I'm trying to make more useful. Then I put this into a model called a structural topic model, which is very simply actually, the math is complex underlying it because language is complex and modeling language is complex. But the idea is quite simple. It's like, let's take all of the words and see which ones correlate with each other, right? So we're looking for clusters of correlated words in documents. And this is the result that we get. So on the x-axis here, what you're seeing is the proportion of topics that are predicted in each of these 10 topic categories. So I specified the number of topics. I said, give me 10 topics to this model, but I did not specify what topics would come out. When the topics come out, I then look at keywords that come out of the model, and I labeled each of those topics. And it takes too long to talk through why I labeled each of them the way I did. I have a backup slide where I can show you the top words and explain it. But what you're seeing then is that women, in the black dot here, talk about teaching, tarbiyah, especially of youth, at twice the rates of men. So 30% of the words that women have on this website are devoted to teaching and education, whereas only 15% for men, right? Westernization, again, it's about double men, and women's issues, so-called, again, it's about double what men are doing. So that really aligns with the gender appropriateness logic of, women are talking more about women's issues, right? Here's where it gets more complicated. Doctrine, which really actually is a large part of that, is like actual Quran verses, right? Which also need to be included in the model, are about equal. And then jurisprudence, monotheism, worship, heterodoxy. Women are talking about these. It's not zero. In fact, the only thing that's close to zero is this hadith citation topic. We'll return back to that. By the way, Selawat here, to give you a sense of like, it really pulls out correlated words. This really is just a topic with all of the sallallahu alaihi wasallams and the radiyallahu anhum and etc. like in the corpus. So these aren't exactly what a human would pick out as topics always, but they do capture correlated words. Okay, so how do women support their arguments? We already got a hint that they don't use hadith very much, but I'm going to show that to you much more carefully. So the Salafi method, if you're not familiar, is to back up your argument with citations to the Hadith and Quran. It has to go back to the prophetic tradition. If it goes back to something else, it's not really viewed as authentic, right? And so here's an example of a cleric named Safar al-Hawali writing against jihadism in Iraq. And the way he makes his argument is that Muslims are hurting other Muslims. And the way he supports his argument is with at least 4 citations. And if you go look at the longer document, it's just like a wall of citations, right? Including, narrated by Sahih Muslim, Al-Bukhari, and then we've got a verse from the Quran to cap it off. In comparison, I'm arguing that women are using identity authority. So they're saying, as a woman, they're invoking their identity as women to make similar arguments. And here's an example. This is on the same topic. So this is Jawahir al-Sheikh, female cleric from Saudi Arabia, arguing against jihadism because it hurts other Muslims. She uses 0 Quran citations, 0 cites to hadith, and instead invokes a motherhood sense, right? This is not an exception. So I find quantitatively that women use personal pronouns 48% more than men. The gender neutral pronouns in Arabic, as you know, there are, gender non-neutral pronouns. Those wouldn't be appropriate for this test, obviously. But this is I, we, and the gender neutral you, right? When we look at other words, and the table is too long for me to talk through all of it, but just trust me that these words on the side here in the italics, and then these names down the side here are important names that have to do with hadith citation. So there's a format for citing hadith, very much like our parenthetical kind of format that we often put in academic papers. It's different than that. But it involves these words and it involves these hadith compilers. And what you're seeing in the table here is that men use these words at roughly double or sometimes triple the rates of women. And in fact, the craziest thing is right here, that in a religious corpus, so all of this is religious text, that men are using the word God 3% of the time. That's a lot. Women are using it half as much. Why are women talking about God half as much? It's not because they are not preaching. It's because they're not using hadith citations, which involve mentioning the Prophet Muhammad, which involves saying sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Okay, this figure I'm now really gonna not talk through as well as I should for time, but you might have been concerned that this was about the topics that women are preaching on. And this figure basically shows that no, regardless of the topic, women use hadith citations less. It's true, the downward slope shows you that, for example, here, the jurisprudence topic, oh, whoops, didn't mean to click through. The jurisprudence topic has a lot of hadith citations. So about 80% of jurisprudence documents will cite at least one hadith compiler. Whereas teaching, it's very low, right? So you might say, well, women focus on teaching, so their hadith citations will naturally be lower. But even when we control for that, there's a gap between men and women. And this gap is the gap between these 2 dotted lines that you see there. And I look at some other hypotheses too. It's not because they don't know how to cite hadith. When we even look at the women who have doctorates in Islamic sciences, they still use less hadith, right? And more identity. Okay. So who reacts to women's writing? Well, unfortunately, the website that I was looking at doesn't have any way to react to the writings in the web format. You can't leave comments, you can't click, you can't like, etc. But they do have a Twitter feed that's publicized their documents since 2014. So I went and looked at that Twitter feed and coded the gender of who retweeted each of the men's and women's writing over a period, over this period. Now, it was by hand. For this one, I actually had one of my Arab graduate students help me because my knowledge of obscure Arab names is not so great, especially what gender they kind of connote. And so some we weren't able to code, right? Like, Twitter handles are not always easy to code. So, there's some measurement error here. But I think the findings still suggest that these are not primarily women retweeting women. We find that only 26% of the retweeters are women. So that means like 74%, right, of the response that these women are getting is from men. I think that's really striking. It's true that women do prefer the writing of women, even when we control for the topic, right? So women's writing on the same topic gets more retweets by women than a man writing on the same topic. But it's still very, very low compared to the number of men retweeting. Female preachers get more one-off tweets, so more people who tweet once and then never tweet again from Saeed.net, and they reach more people who don't otherwise follow the Saeed.net Twitter channel. So this is actually showing you that they're reaching new audiences. But this doesn't really show us how they react to women's writing because, unfortunately, the Twitter responses are mostly just retweets. They're very thin. There's no commentary. There's not a lot of like, oh, I loved this, or oh, this was terrible, right? So instead, I went to aluka.net. And the reason I went to aluka.net, and I'm skipping ahead, these are slides showing you that aluka.net is important and is similar to Saeed.net, et cetera, and has, you know, some of the same female preachers on it and the same documents, et cetera. But really, it has comments. So here's the comments. And I even tested to try to add a comment to figure out what the process was really like. And there is some moderation, which, you know, we can talk about. I think the moderation is affecting, you know, probably like really negative things are removed. But I did try to put in some critical comments, and those went through just fine. So it is okay to criticize on this website. But you can see a lot of it is like, Jazakallah khair, right? Like you just say like, wow, amazing, congratulations, like, etc. So let's look at what happens in the comments. And what we see, the ideal experiment here we would do is we would have the same piece of writing, right? And we would change whether the perception is that it's a man or a woman. So we'd actually change, as you're looking on the website here, we would change the name. So instead of being Sarah bint Muhammad Hassan, it would be like Muhammad Hassan, right? Or something like that. And then we would have the same document, and then we'd see, does it get more positive comments as a woman? Does it get more positive comments as a man? Does it get more clicks as a woman? Does it get more clicks as a man, etc., right? Now, we can't do that experiment because I'm not the administrator of this website. And also, I have a chapter arguing that experimenting with people's religion is kind of a messed up thing to do for a number of reasons, which are mostly obvious to non-social scientists. But since social scientists are very interested in doing experiments these days, at least in my neck of the woods, sometimes they need to be told that experimenting with people's religion is kind of messed up. So instead, I'm going to use another statistical model. And this is one I developed with several colleagues and published last year, where we find very similar documents in terms of their topical content, but one was written by a man and one was written by a woman. And when we compare those documents, and I'm going to skip the details because I'm definitely, like my watch says I'm right at 35 minutes. The findings are that women get fewer page views, which cuts against my argument, right? So women are not as popular as men on the aluka.net website. But once we account for that, women get more comments. So they get about one more per document, which is actually 120% increase because the modal document by a man gets 0 comments. And then the next most common number is 1, right? So women are getting, 2 comments for every 1 by a man. Women do get more comments from women, but men still comment most on women's documents. So that's a little confusing. So let me say a woman's document is getting, on average, 46% female comments and 54% male comments. Again, this is for me going through the names that are listed by the commenters and trying to code them, including, unknown when it's really not clear. Commenters on women's documents are more geographically diverse. So you can actually, I'll flip back and see if I show this. Yeah, so you can see here. So this first comment is by Tashfin, and she says she's in Al-Andalus, right? So that shows you how we're seeing both the gender and the location of somebody. So I coded those locations. and the locations are more geographically diverse on the women's documents, and women get more positive comments than men, and it's actually driven by male commenters. So male commenters are the ones piling onto these women's posts saying, you know, I basically searched for phrase words, Jazak al Akhir, Mabruk, etc., right? So I think this shows that there is a receptive male audience for these female preachers. I think it's very interesting that it's happening online and not in physical spaces as of yet. Certainly not happening in physical space in Saudi Arabia. If you want to go study with these women in Saudi Arabia, which you cannot be me, right? Like I cannot imagine a world where I could even really go interview these women in person. Like that's a pretty hard thing to imagine. Certainly not sitting in their study circles like I sat in study circles at Al-Azhar, where, by the way, there were no women, except for the Quran recitation study circles. Like women are okay to go to those at Al-Azhar. So this is challenging prior scholarship. Al-Rashid, in that book I mentioned, says that female preachers enter the public sphere only as women preaching to other women. That's a direct quote. But I'm finding that they do focus on women's issues, but also write on other topics for a mixed gender audience, including that one I showed you about, you know, not waging jihad, which is like definitely aimed at men. Like that clip itself by Jawahir al-Sheikh, like cannot be aimed at women primarily. Amélie Le Renard, whose book I also really admire, argues that these female preachers, she is able to go do ethnography with them. She argues that they rely heavily on citations to Quran and Hadith. That may be true for the in-person meetings she was seeing. Certainly I do see Quran and Hadith in their writings, but a lot less than men. Instead, they're evoking their identities as women. Close and Kunkler argue that women are confined to female audiences because believers still prefer male religious authorities. I find mixed evidence here, right? Like, I mean, the clicks were lower for women, but the reactions were extremely positive on Twitter and on aluka.net. Or sorry, there were a lot of reactions on Twitter and they were positive on aluka.net. And more broadly, I think this is showing that the internet is changing Islamic authority. Female Salafi preachers are constructing their authority differently than men. I think that's interesting on a number of levels. And that the internet may be opening up space for female authorities more generally. I have, as I'm closing, 2 extensions I'm working on. So if you read the paper, you saw that there was a short little bit about white nationalist women. And the honest truth is that this wasn't supposed to be in the paper at all. And then a reviewer, actually, you know, I hadn't even had this idea. And one of the very helpful reviewers was like, why don't you do a whole other research paper to show us that this isn't just about, you know, like weird Muslims being weird, right? And I was very annoyed about this, but then actually got quite interested in where this is playing out in other places. And so I looked at women in the white nationalist movement and found very similar things happening. And I now have a full paper that isn't quite ready to release, but that uses YouTube data to show what women are doing in the white nationalist movement, especially in the US and in Europe. And then I'm also just starting to look at the role of women in the Islamic State in Iraq wal-Sham, or sorry, in the Levant and Iraq, whatever the name is. Honestly, can't even keep up. The Islamic State, we'll just call it now, the now defunct, hopefully, Islamic State, although they just had that really terrible attack in Baghdad that they claimed credit for. I'm interested in the role that women were playing there. Okay, and with that, I will return to the title slide. I went a little long, I'm sorry. And I look forward to your questions, comments, and whatever discussion you want to have.
Thank you, Richard. I'll open the floor to questions, so feel free to just raise the hand or intervene directly. Andrea?
Oh, pardon me. I was just clapping. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Zoom etiquette.
Thank you very much. No need to put you on the spot.
Sophia?
Yes, hi, thank you. I joined a bit later because I forgot. Anyways, I'm really, really interested in the topic, and thank you for your interesting presentation. And I was just wondering, because I'm actually like, I was thinking of comparing the role of women in ISIS and in white nationalist movements for one of my classes. So that's really interesting. And I was just wondering whether you already have some findings that correlate to the findings that you just presented for the white nationalist movement, and whether you would be so kind to already to share them, or whether you want to wait for your paper to be published.
Oh, sure. First, so yes, I have an almost ready to release draft of the white nationalist paper. Although I believe at the end it says like insert conclusion here, and then it's just a bunch of questions for the writing group that I sent it to most recently. But I'd be happy to send that to you. If you send me an email, I'll put my email here in the chat. Well, I have an MIT email, but yeah, we'll go with the MIT email. They both go to the same place, but all right. So feel free to email me and I will send that to you.
Thank you.
And I would say that I don't have any findings for the Islamic State yet. I've been collecting data basically, but honestly, it got, like everything, got stalled with the pandemic. And so I don't really have any comparison results to tell you. With the white nationalist women, where it's gone actually is that the most interesting finding out of all the YouTube data I collected. So I collected about 15,000 YouTube videos, and then I'm analyzing both the text of those videos, but also I use some facial recognition algorithms and some image recognition algorithms. So, the stuff that I was showing today really doesn't have a lot of video or images along with it. It's web, honestly, like 1.0 or 1.5, right? Like very boring web. You have to be really into Islam to love this website, which then it's crazy how much traffic it gets. It gets a ton of traffic. It was like at one point it was like the 7th ranked website in Saudi Arabia, which is just like crazy. But the YouTube stuff has all this like image going on as well. And what I find is that women are actually more able to drum up racism than men. So when you go look at the comments on the YouTube videos, the comments are more racist on average on the women's videos than on the men's. And so once I found that, like a lot of the paper was intended as a direct comparison, I was basically going to replicate the work I just showed you. And then I was like, never mind, that's an interesting new finding. And the paper is really reoriented around that. But this isn't to talk about the white nationalists, although I could talk about white nationalists for a very long time too. That's where those findings stand right now. We're trying to run out an experimental test of our findings, which is why the paper's been stalled, but I'm very happy to send it to you. And I'm happy to answer more questions about the white nationalism component. It was in the paper, but I don't want to go on too long. Thanks.
Thank you.
And Varvara might be next.
Yes, hello. I was just like, I didn't really understand this part with the website. You said that like women's pages, I don't know, like women's accounts were created without their like knowledge that they were created. Like, what was the purpose of this? Like, why was it man who created that, or like what was it for?
Yeah.
Just like, I didn't understand it.
To be honest, I don't fully understand it either. And the Saeed.net administrators won't return my emails. So, which, seeing as it's based in Saudi Arabia, and like I have some notion of who runs it, like I'm not super surprised that they both don't want to talk to me and don't have the time to talk to me, right? I mean, on one hand, they're just busy, right? They're running, one of the top, it's in the top 1,000 websites at least in Saudi still. So it would be really helpful if they would tell me what they were thinking, but I don't know for sure. So let me tell you what I backed out from the email interviews I was able to do. So what I learned is that most of the men who responded to me asked to be on the Said.net website. So they petitioned the administrators of the website to get put on that list and to have their documents posted there. Most of the women who wrote back to me, but it's not a very large number. It's like, I want to say it's like 5, right? So I'm really just going to use them as illustrative of how women might end up on this website, because it's really not, oh, hey, Karsten. It's really not, I really can't say it's representative of the trends, right? But several of the women said that they had writings posted elsewhere online, and then that a page was made for them by the administrators and put up on Said.net without asking them. And then when they posted new things on the other places that they posted online, those were then collected and put onto Said.net. So that means some Salafi administrator went and found women's preaching elsewhere online, was like, this is useful to us, we're going to put it on our website, which really undermines the notion that like all of these women are necessarily insurgents within the Salafi movement trying to, fight their way against a male leadership that doesn't want them there, which is what you would get from the hardcore version of the gender appropriateness logic. Several of the other women, had more of a collaborative relationship where they were approached and then they started writing for it. And as I said, one of the women, sees herself as a researcher on women's issues. So she calls herself a Bahth Ilmi, right? As like a researcher, right? But the website insisted, in fact, told her that she needed to be listed as a da'iya, as a female cleric, to be on the website. And she was like, oh, okay, I'm fine with that, right? But again, this was a case where, like her preaching, which I do think, I've read it, it like counts as religious, but it is not. Certainly, this is another example of the Salafi administrators trying to actually claim more authority for one of these women, not less, right? So that's, sorry, I'm rehashing some of the stuff I already told you, but that's what I was able to glean from the few interviews I could, the few people I could get to respond to me about what the process looked like for getting on there. It seems like there's some back and forth with the administrators, but there's no censoring of what gets posted once you're sending your stuff to them, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I see Anil next.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting talk. I'm really sorry if I missed it. It has been a long day, but I was wondering what would you think about this gender appropriateness? For example, if the number of the female preachers increase, or, if the men and women started to talk about the same issues to the same extent, or the women somehow increase their influence among the followers. So I would be curious to hear your opinions if you think that there might be like this social movement aspect and the active selection of the female preachers might be negatively affected if they feel that there is some threat from the gender side.
I see. Let me restate to make sure I'm answering the right question. So so one aspect of what you just said, are these women, the 43 on the website, are they feeling pressure to write about certain topics and not others because of a threat or a norm or whatever against doing so? And then I also might have heard, although I'm not sure in your question, kind of a question about whether this will change the gender norms in Salafism or in Islam more broadly going forward.
More the second one, but
Okay.
not in terms of the gender norms, but because you mentioned that there's not much reaction, right? So there is not a negative attitude as expected. And I was wondering if this is because still they are seen as fringe, they are marginal.
Yes, and a very good point, actually. so we know that people who are in the minority seeking to gain power and authority often are viewed as sort of cute, almost. That's like, oh, that's nice that you think you could be in charge, until they reach the critical threshold where they start to actually have some authority, and then the entrenched authorities get very nervous and there's a backlash, et cetera, right? I've been very focused on, we'll say, racial issues in the United States over the last, 2 weeks, frankly, have been quite eventful in our country. So I think this is playing out, in the US, it plays out all over the place. I do think these women feel that they have to thread the needle on gender norms very carefully. None of their images appear on the website. And it's very hard to find images of many of them, right? So that they are conforming to a set of gender norms that says you don't appear, right? Like even your face cannot be shown in public, right? Yet their preaching, is out there, and so I think they're navigating a set of religious permissions that allow them to preach when it's useful, as long as they conform very strictly to certain other gender norms. And it doesn't hurt that like Jawahir al-Sheikh, for example, is related to very prominent clerics, and someone I know, an anthropologist of Saudi Arabia, described her basically as like a princess of sorts in Saudi. I'm not sure if I totally agree with that characterization, but it gives you a sense that she's like known and has also some protection, right? So maybe being associated with a prominent cleric protects you against gender-based discrimination in the preaching sphere that you would face otherwise. Now, I think this is going to change gender norms in Salafi Islam. I think that the track record of other faiths that increase the authority women have to preach, basically suggests that once this happens, it's very hard to draw down, and they may end up with kind of continuing to navigate this set of norms, but with increased authority. And the internet is going to, I think, make that speed up, because it's very hard to be a gatekeeper on the internet. They can take all their writings off, but now that they've put them on Twitter, anyone in Saudi can go find them. Does that answer what you were hoping to hear from me? The final thing I'll say on this is that it puts me in a strange position of being sort of the gender optimist about how things are going in Saudi Arabia, where a lot of these women are based, which we had, we had a Saudi dissident at MIT that we were hosting last maybe 2 years ago now, who's very pessimistic, obviously, about the conditions in Saudi. She's not in Saudi for because she faces persecution there, and so I don't want to be. I'm in no way trying to kind of whitewash things for the current Saudi government, which is detest a strong enough word? That I don't know. Anyway, but and also I think it's complicated, right, to have empowered women who then serve, who then are using that empowerment to serve, to increase the reach of patriarchy, right? I think that's a thing that flies in the face of a lot of feminist scholarship in the United States, where I know it best. But I still think it's going to change the norms within Salafi Islam, and in ways that I would argue are positive, perhaps a net of everything else that's going on in Saudi. Thank you.
Hagar, would you like to go, or?
Yeah,
Sure. Thank you, Professor Nielsen. It was a great presentation. So I have a couple of unstructured thoughts, maybe encouraging. So one, I think you have something with immense policy and security relevance on your hand as well, because especially in the internet, when these types of writings are being shared and not necessarily credited to a source, it gets quite hard to distinguish and find cues. Especially, think of the diaspora Muslim community trying to prevent radicalization. Male Salafist speakers are easy to spot because they use citations, but also because they use citations of certain Quranic verses. But it gets very tricky with women, and especially with topics like tarbiyah, which are, everyone's sort of concerned about raising the youth properly against the evil influences of the West. So that's one thing. And I also definitely want to encourage continued research with women in ISIS and generally Jihadi Jane, because it's not as observable. The ways how women recruit, and it also, when it comes to surveillance, so from security concerns, oftentimes it's men that get surveilled, observed, that get paid attention. Women sort of fall through the grid, I mean. And one of those modes, one of those ways that I've, for instance, so I'm German, I'm from Germany. When jihadis or Salafis try to recruit us, it's usually women, and they usually wrap you into the conversation, starting with something like a hijab. And starting with, aren't you upset that Europeans don't like your headscarf? Something like that, talking about very common grievances you would have. And it's incredibly hard to find out, what's their intention. And then in the end up, you end up radicalized. Yeah. So, just to highlight that your research has a lot of policy relevance and security relevance.
Thank you for that comment. Also for the interesting insights into your own experiences. That's fascinating. Obviously, no one's ever actually, no, they have tried to recruit me to Salafism, but they used, I will say they used a very different approach.
Yeah. No, I'm from Frankfurt in Germany, and a while ago we did have a massive problem with Salafis, and there was quite a Salafi hub. So I don't know if you've heard of that preacher. So Pierre Vogel was quite active in Frankfurt, and they've had a lot of congregations around downtown and surveillance of mosques and preaching in the open, trying to recruit. And whenever it was about women, it was always those, low threshold topics like, oh, aren't you annoyed again that the Germans don't like you in your headscarf? And then, yeah.
I mean, to be honest, like, I get it, right? So the I see the annoyance. The research assistant who I mentioned, the PhD student who's now off to a postdoc at Brookings, who I mentioned is doing help on the talk, is a a veiled Shia woman from Iraq, who, for lack of a, isn't very, very kind way to say it, but she gets a lot of crap in the US for, for how she dresses, and she's just gotten good at
exactly.
managing her feelings
in certain spaces where you look for female scholarship and then not being able to find a certain cue that, oh no, this is a Salafi, this is going into a very, that's quite contributes to the problem of radicalization, especially for women in patriarchal societies who often have the role of educators, those that raise their families, those that teach their children and their husbands, which is also the role ascribed to women within jihadis. So other than the active combatants, as a woman, jihadi Jane, she's supposed to educate and raise. So yeah, just encouraging you also to continue this and to think of including policy recommendations.
So I'll take the encouragement, especially on the continuing the research front. Well, as I sort of mentioned in the talk, COVID time has not been my most productive, and I'll say that my kids are doing online school like 10 feet from me through a wall, right? So like,
Yeah.
let's just say there's been real barriers to getting things done. And so, but this talk itself is kind of reminding me like, oh, I need to get going on the rest of this stuff. So thank you all. You know, here's why I'm a little cautious with policy recommendations at times, and why I'm not making too many just yet. So political science generally spends a lot of time wringing its hands about how it's not policy relevant enough, right? And you know, there's this like fear of decline of the, you know, the role of the political scientist in the Washington Beltway and, you know, in the halls of the EU and other places, right? I actually face the opposite problem, which is because my research is can be easily securitized, right? So I study jihadist preachers online, and you know, various folks in the U.S. government are very happy to talk to me about what my research is finding. And so I've done some of that, but I also try hard to keep them at arm's length so that my kind of credibility as a scholar basically isn't compromised. And if you know something about the politics of like studying the Middle East in the US especially, I think there is a real concern that certain scholars are, honestly, you know, people are concerned that they're bought and paid for by the US government to reach certain conclusions that lead to things like the, you know, the Muslim ban that was just, you know, rescinded by executive order by the new president. And so I'm like,
I see. Yeah, my field is military and Middle East, so I sort of in a similar predicament. But
yeah, but I think you're right. I need to think more about this, and simply just the issue of like, can people detect where this preaching leads? Like, just simply like, and my hunch is that lay Muslims are very savvy and can often pick out like, oh, I headed 3 links down the link tree and I saw where this was going, so like I didn't get in, right? But there are these stories of people, you know, getting sucked in, and you know, even if it's, you know, 1% getting sucked away on the margin into something that their former self wouldn't agree to, right? That, you know, that can be a big absolute number. Yeah, so I will do more thinking about what I think this means from a policy perspective. I really hadn't, actually, I'm glad to hear you say that you think it has policy implications, because honestly, I sort of thought it didn't, or at least not in the sense that my work on jihadis earlier did.
Yeah, I'm happy to stay in touch with you on that matter. But yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was great, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. And for sticking with me on Zoom this long.
Okay. If there are no other questions, I might go for a clarification and a question. So I was wondering whether you could come back to the last slides where you skipped the statistical text analysis when you compare the documents, the very similar documents for men and women.
Yes.
And tell us more like how you did that. But also I was wondering if maybe what explains the receptive male audience for female content. Can we say that, or can we for some reason maybe control for the different regions where maybe men and women more or less have the same share of internet access, or maybe it's just like a matter of various levels, like on average there will be more men having more internet access than women in certain areas.
Just a second, I'm making a note here. Okay, can you see the slides? I'm not gonna put them in full screen here. Okay, so actually I'll take the second question first and just say, that's a very good idea. It's not actually something I've taken into account in this analysis, and it's the sort of thing that maybe I could, because we have some, so the Pew surveys, for example, give some indication, at least on the country level, of internet penetration of the respondent, whether they have access to certain types of internet. And I think we have that by gender. And I'm a little embarrassed to say I haven't thought nearly as hard about gender differences in internet access throughout the Arab Muslim world as I ought to have. So thank you for that question. Obviously, then I don't have a really great answer because, if this were a job talk, I would really want to flip to a slide that says, I already thought of this. And by the way, the answer is X. We're not doing that. This is not that talk. I told you that there were improvements to be made, and this is definitely one. Thank you. So what's going on with this comparison between similar documents by men and women? So I'll admit, I have a tendency to get way too into methodological things. So stop me if I'm going too deep. I mean, I have a master's in statistics, and I honestly just actually, my brain just thinks this way. And so I enjoy doing it. I understand when people don't. So what we're trying to mimic here is a qualitative process. And this qualitative process. For example, when you're trying to do research, you try to identify similar papers to yours, right? And if one is too similar, then you might be accused of plagiarism, right? Like if someone does exactly your same argument, well, that's already been done. We don't need that contribution to the literature, right? So we have a qualitative sense of what it means to read documents and find them to be similar. Now, what we're really trying to do in this setting, we'd like a set of contrasts where we had, as I said, the same document and we change a man or woman's name. Now, there's an alternative experiment that we could consider that we're not really here, which is that we actually pick a topic and an argument and then assign a man to write on it and a woman to write on it. And the difference here is that presumably in that second experiment I'm talking about, the man would write in a man style and would use a lot of hadith and Quran citations, and the woman would write in a woman style and would use fewer hadith and Quran citations. Now, we're somewhere in between these because the way that we did this is we put a topic model, the same kind of topic model as I showed before, onto all of the documents from aluka.net. And I used two different pools of documents. You can see here that we ended up with sample 1 and sample 2. I think we were choosing from, oh gosh, I don't have the exact number on the slides, but it's like 24,000 documents on aluka.net or something like that. So in the first, I picked just the 17 Salafi women from Saeed.net. Now, it's not all of them because there were 43 on Saeed.net, right? This is just the 17 that we have overlap on aluka.net, right? So, some gap there. Then we took each of their documents and said, what is the document that has the most similar topic proportions? But we excluded the hadith and silhouette topics. I'm saying we, it's the royal we. I excluded the hadith and silhouette topics. I apologize. I am so used to doing work with co-authors that in presentation mode, I slip into we very quickly. But I think it's pretentious. It's done on purpose. So I allowed more documents to match. We could do the matching in several ways, but this is a kind of matching called coarsened exact matching, which basically, if there are more documents than one that match, it allows them to match. But it makes it so that it doesn't have to be an exact match. It's a match within a bin. So it's like, well, it has between 70% and 80% of topic X, and it has between 0.1 and 0.2% of topic Y, right? Matching on 15 topics is actually quite rigorous, quite strenuous, because having something match on a couple of topics is pretty easy to do. Matching on all 15 within these bandwidths is fairly difficult. So that's why the numbers dropped from 24,000 to around 1,000, right? So we end up with 993 documents that match these 242 documents by women. And then we're going to do our regular statistical analysis. It's not very complex. It's just difference in means or a regression with a few controls to get these summaries. And I don't have the regression tables handy, but these are all going to come out of just a regression where the outcome is the metadata on those documents. So like the number of views, which we have, the number of comments, the quality of the comments, whatever, on that matched set. And this is going to be the closest we can do to mimicking that ideal experiment. There's still going to be a pretty big gap. So like if I could run that, some people have actually told me to run that experiment, and I'm on the fence about whether to try it or not. Does that help clarify what's going on with that methodological section? And if anyone wants to try any of this, I do have material on my website for estimating these models. Also, replication data for both of these papers is up on my website already, so you can see exactly what I did in completely brutal detail. Full disclosure, I think the one for the AJPS takes about 30 hours to run, so it's like quite computationally intense. But also, since we're here on the call, I'm happy to walk you through it and help get people started if you want to pursue this style of research, because working through my code files can be quite intimidating simply because I'm bad at writing them and they're not very well commented, and it's a little hard to follow sometimes what I did, even despite my best efforts.
Thank you. Okay. I don't see any hands.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Rick. Thank you for being with us, and we really enjoyed your talk and looking forward to see more of your research and papers published. Thank you all for joining and being with us on a late Friday evening. So I hope.
Yes. Thank you everyone for being here. I know what time it is where many of you are. I'm so sorry. And thank you for the questions, the engagement, etc.
Well, bye-bye. Thank you all.